Okay, hello and welcome to this lecture on the ways in which social media can influence voting behaviour. I looked into the influence of media more generally in my last lecture on the role of short-term factors influencing voting behaviour, and I also touched a little on social media in particular in the section on campaigning. But in this lecture I wanted to look in a little more depth at the role of social media in influencing voting behaviour, as it's become such a controversial and heated topic in recent years, especially due to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which I will touch on in this lecture. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to basically look at three ways in which social media has arguably influenced voting behaviour. So, firstly, social media has allowed for the rise in what is called the micro-targeting of political ads, on a scale that has never before been possible. Social media sites collect unprecedented amounts of personal data on their users, from basics like their age, the region where they live, their ethnicity, and so on. And they use this data to build up a detailed picture of each user's interests, psychology, and preferences by analysing their clicks, their likes, and their browsing history. In 2016, Cambridge Analytica illegally managed to get hold of the personal data of 87 million Facebook users. Cambridge Analytica is run by Trump's outright campaign manager, Steve Bannon, and funded by Trump's financial patron, Robert Mercer. Now, Cambridge Analytica was then paid by both the Trump campaign and the Leave campaign to analyze this illegally obtained data in order to target specific groups of voters with highly personalized, tailored political propaganda on behalf of those campaigns. Vote Leave then also used another company, which is actually the sister company really, so kind of another wing of Cambridge Analytica, AIQ, to whom it paid almost half of its entire campaign budget of £7 million to target 1.5 billion tailored adverts at just 7 million voters who had been identified as persuadable, mostly in the final week of the campaign. Incidentally, this last-minute bombardment of advertising was also illegal, as the campaign had already reached its official campaign spending limits by that time. Dominic Cummings claims that these last-minute micro-targeted ads were essential to Vote Leave's success. As we know, the rise of partisan de-alignment means that more and more voters are becoming swing voters, undecided on how to vote from one vote to the next, and therefore potentially much more open to last-minute persuasion by such techniques. So such micro-targeting of undecided voters can clearly have a powerful effect, especially if they're bombarded with messages specifically tailor-made to appeal to their specific psychological makeup. The fact that Dominic Cummings, head of the Vote Leave campaign, claimed to have spent 98% of his entire campaign budget online suggests that this targeted advertising is deemed very effective by those involved. On the other hand, there is evidence that such micro-targeting has become less commonplace in subsequent votes. Facebook spending by the Conservatives, for example, was halved in 2019 compared to their 2017 spending. Instead, they invested record resources in YouTube advertising, with much less targeted banner adverts and video adverts popping up on users' screens. This seems to indicate a return to more traditional saturation campaign tactics, aiming to spread the same message everywhere and away from the micro-targeting, tailor-made advertising of the Trump and Brexit campaigns. A second way in which social media could be seen to influence voting behaviour is by reaching the youth. As we know, young people are the least likely to vote in UK elections, but the most likely to engage with social media. So, there is an argument that by engaging in social media, political campaigns may be able to mobilise the otherwise more disengaged young people to actually turn out and vote in a way that traditional media would not be able to. Evidence for this argument comes from the 2017 UK general election, in which Corbyn's supporters were very active on social media, and Labour was widely acknowledged to have won the social media campaign. In this election, turnout amongst the under-25s grew from under 45% to 60%, the highest turnout amongst that age group since 1992. In 2019, when Labour activists were again very active and visible on social media, turnout amongst under-25s rose again, the only age group to see a rise in turnout in this election, reaching 65%, putting them ahead of 25 to 45-year-olds. The fact that the majority of these young voters had turned out to vote Labour suggests that it may have been Labour's use of social media that was responsible for this increase in youth turnout. However, we cannot prove there's a definite causal link between Labour's savvy use of social media and this rise in the youth vote. It may be that young people were moved to turn out to vote Labour by other factors, and that Labour's enlarged presence on social media was a reflection rather than a cause of their increased popularity amongst the young. It could be, for example, that young people turned to Labour in the Corbyn years due to his policies of ending tuition fees or increasing affordable housing, or due to his reputation as a campaigner against war and racism. Having won their support, young people may well have then turned to social media to express this support for Labour rather than the other way around, rather than social media being responsible for their engagement. And turnout amongst the young still remains significantly below that of older voters, limiting the impact social media's engagement of them can affect overall election outcomes. One final way in which social media has impacted voting behaviour is through the rise of populist politicians. One key way in which social media differs from traditional media is through the supposed absence of gatekeepers. In traditional media, only the opinions that are selected by the editor, who's in turn appointed by the owner, actually get published. As Hannon Swaffer once put it, freedom of the press in Britain means freedom to print such of the proprietors of prejudices as the advertisers don't object to. Ultimately, men like Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere and a handful of other billionaires who control the vast majority of UK newspapers decide who gets published and who does not. On social media, of course, there are no such restrictions. Anyone can air their opinions and potentially even get a following of millions. This has arguably led to a rise in anti-establishment populism. Anti-establishment views that in times gone by would have been suppressed by men like Rupert Murdoch are now widespread, thanks to the apparent freedom provided by social media platforms, according to this argument. This has in turn fueled the rise of other platforms and parties pushing such views. In 2016, for example, Steve Bannon's alt-right Breitbart website received more traffic than CNN. It was only the unleashing of such views through social media, the argument goes, that made the rise of populism possible, leading directly to the era of Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro, and all the rest of the populist movements. Indeed, platforms like Twitter have allowed such politicians to speak directly to their followers and to reach out to people who would not otherwise engage in politics, and to increase their electoral base and build their movement in the process. My problem with this argument is twofold. Firstly, far from being suppressed by the billionaire class who own the newspapers, this class has been pushing precisely the narratives that men like Trump have cashed in on. Anti-immigrant hostility is a case in point. Papers like The Sun and the Daily Mail have for decades pushed the most lurid anti-immigrant propaganda, making people ripe for the messages of Trump and the Leave campaign. In other words, the very term anti-establishment to describe the politics of right-wing populism is, in my opinion, very misleading. They're simply pushing establishment politics to its logical conclusions. Secondly, the idea that there are no gatekeepers in social media is frankly absurd. Whilst it's true that pretty much anyone can publish their opinions on social media sites, the algorithms that determine which items get pushed out and which get suppressed are entirely controlled and designed by the same billionaire class who control the newspapers, and are thus likely to serve the same interests. Whilst the exact algorithms are used to shroud it in secrecy, it's very likely that views challenging to the status quo are quietly buried, hidden from news feeds and rendered largely invisible as soon as they're published, whilst those which are acceptable are promoted and pushed out, especially perhaps if they're posing as anti-establishment and somehow rebellious, as this is likely to give them what are essentially establishment politics an additional reach. Okay, so those are three ways in which social media has perhaps affected voting behaviour. Before I finish off, I just want to draw your attention to some potential nuances that can arise in the phrasing of exam questions on voting behaviour, and specifically the difference between questions that ask about how various factors influence voting behaviour and how those factors influence election outcomes. So just pause the video here and see if you can think of one or two ways in which your answer might be slightly different, depending on whether the question was asking about voting behaviour or about election outcomes. Okay, so do that now. Okay, any ideas? Broadly speaking, you'd make the same sort of points in both questions, but I'll draw your attention to three subtle differences. Firstly, the term voting behaviour could refer to voting in referendums as well as elections, whereas a question specifically about election outcomes would obviously only refer to voting in elections and not referendums. This doesn't mean you couldn't refer to referendums in a question on election outcomes, but make sure you add a phrase like, these tendencies are likely to influence election outcomes as well, or something like that. Just show that you understand that referendums are not actually the focus of the question. Secondly, questions about election outcomes can legitimately include consideration of issues beyond voting behaviour that might yet influence the election's outcome. So pause the video here and think, what other factor might influence the outcome of elections other than voting behaviour? Any ideas? The answer, of course, is the voting system used in the election. As we know from the election of Trump in 2016, for example, when he won the election despite getting fewer votes than his opponent, we know that the electoral system used in an election can be a key factor in determining electoral outcomes. As we also know, the first past the post electoral system tends to create a so-called winner's bonus and generally translates a plurality of seats, simply gaining more seats than any other party, into a majority of seats, even if the winning party only received a minority of votes. So this shows that the voting system used, in this case first past the post, is directly influencing election outcomes. Again, this doesn't mean that the voting system can't be mentioned in questions about voting behaviour. As we know, the voting system used does indeed influence how people actually vote as well, as first past the post, for example, tends to encourage tactical voting. But your explanations will obviously be slightly different in each case. Finally, it's generally understood that election outcomes are determined specifically by swing voters in marginal constituencies. Until very recently, most seats were safe seats, and most voters were not swing voters. So a question focusing on voting behaviour is asking about what influences everyone's voting behaviour, whereas a question focusing on election outcomes is in a way really just asking about what influences the votes of swing voters in marginal constituencies, because they're the ones whose votes make a difference to the election outcome. Of course, now that swing voters have become the majority of the electorate, the difference is becoming less pronounced, but it still exists. However, these are all quite subtle differences in nuance and are unlikely to majorly affect the overall structure or basic points you raise in your essays. They're more just things to bear in mind and to consider in the way that you explain the various factors at play. Okay, so thank you for listening. Hope it was useful.